Welcome to the Dream, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host Amashi, and it's time for some Baldur's Gate 3 news. Eric Van Allen over on Destructoid interviewed Swen Vincke recently about Baldur's Gate 3's early access, and I figured I'd do a reaction video, because Swen's interviews have always been a treat for me. Please remember to like the video and leave a comment down below on your thoughts of the interview, as well as your thoughts on my reactions. And please remember to subscribe to the channel if you like what you see. I've got a lot of video essays planned on Baldur's Gate 3, as well as other RPGs, so stay tuned. This CRPG is still changing shape. Putting a game out early to the public can be tricky, but early access is not new to Larian Studios anymore. The RPG studio utilized a staggered launch with Divinity Original Sin and its sequel to their success, and now at Baldur's Gate 3, it's looking for a third win. That doesn't mean there haven't been growing pains, though. Baldur's Gate 3 is a different kind of game from Original Sin 2. It has a different combat system, a more cinematic approach, and is firmly rooted in the old tomes of Dungeons & Dragons. These things are true. Following the recent addition of the Druid class and another panel from Hell, we reached out to Larian to see just how its early access has been progressing. On a call with studio founder Swen Vincke, the studio head says that they've been receiving a lot of feedback from the community, through both analytics and vocal feedback on forums like Reddit, and there have been a few course corrections. I know that the community wants us to go faster than we can, Vincke tells me over a video chat. It does take time to implement things, especially for a game that's as vast as Baldur's Gate 3, also a game that we're still developing. So we have to balance the two things to each other. A lot of these people who want Baldur's Gate 3 out faster are crazy. That said, I do think Larian could alleviate some of this by doing monthly or bi-monthly AMAs, maybe occasional casual developer streams. Nothing fancy like you guys have been doing lately with the panel from Hell. I miss the days where you just sit down with a streamer and passionately talk about the game you're working on. There are a lot of frustrated people that want to give helpful feedback, but the long stretches of silence that Larian goes on often feels like, to them, like Larian isn't listening, or that Larian doesn't care. Things like casual streams and AMAs go a long way in showing the people that want to help you that you still care and are passionate. I'm happy that Swen is happy. This man, his friends, and the entirety of the entity that is Larian Studios have had a, well, to say rough time in the games industry is a massive understatement. I'd heavily recommend watching the DOS 1 documentary if you don't know the whole story.
I've had moments where I was trying to put gasoline in my car and I didn't have, my bank card just ended and I was standing there and I had no fuel, I couldn't pay it. I had to call my wife/partner, we're not married, but I mean, we've been together for a long time. And I said, I need cash to pay the bloody fuel. So I was still making payroll, but I didn't have anything.
There are several areas that Vincke says this team has identified, though it's important to separate the good feedback from the bad. There are certain pillars Larian is trying to establish with Baldur's Gate 3, and some of them are going to be different from the Divinity series that Larian fans are more familiar with. Real time with pause is one concept Vincke says Larian won't be implementing. Good! I'm sorry, Real Time with Pause fans, but you can't have both good Real Time with Pause and good turn-based. One or both will suffer. There's literally no way around this. You can't keep trying to mash a square peg into a round hole. In other places, the studio is standing firm on its pillars. The use of dice has been a particular wrinkle that Larian is still trying to solve. It's core to Dungeons & Dragons, but for those not looking to do some traditional role-playing, it can be frustrating. It can be frustrating for people that are interested in doing role-playing, but I'll get back to that in a moment. It brings back memories, actually, of Original Sin 2, where it was about other topics, which was the armor system, which was also polarizing, right? Vincke recalls, or God forbid, durability, which was a fight where we had to swallow our pride and say, okay, well, this is the end of durability as we know it. Durability in Divinity Original Sin 2 is basically a non-factor. It's only a factor if you're using your weapons to break down doors constantly. Otherwise, you'll never even notice it's there, which in my opinion was a good change. I wish I had fought harder against the change of making Bless require a source point back in DOS 2's EA. The problem of everything being covered in Necrofire late game would have been less of an issue for people if it was. In regards to the armor system, I was in the camp in favor of it. Having played the game to completion several times, there is one thing they needed to do to help make hybrid specs more viable. They shouldn't have locked status effects to a specific armor type, and instead locked whether or not you inflicted the correct statuses based on your weapon type. If you're wielding a wand or a staff, you have to deplete magic armor to inflict statuses, and if your weapon type is a physical, you have to deplete the opposite armor type, and vice versa. There would be problems with this approach as well that would need to be ironed out, but this is just what I had been thinking about. Haven't really developed this idea further because I'm kinda done with modding DOS 2 for now anyway, and I don't think anyone else would want to put in the work now with BG3 in development. Baldur's Gate 3 has kept its dice, but the solution has been a mechanic the studio is calling loaded dice. If a pseudo RNG system that will try to balance out all those one rolls you keep getting. It's still being tinkered with, as Vincke says. The studio took a very conservative approach to start, but it's reflective of Larian's approach to feedback. We need to figure out, are people playing the game that we want them to be playing? Or is the game somewhere failing at communicating it, Vincke says. That's the goal that they're looking at through an enormous cloud of player feedback, and yes, the cloud is enormous. I have not enjoyed my time using loaded dice in BG3, as my Baldur's Gate 3 Let's Play critique can attest to. Hopefully, I don't remember if there are any more rolls after this. Now that I've gotten a 19, the weighted dice is probably going to give my next roll a 1. In fact, I only got that 19 because my previous roll was a 3. I think that you could very easily have your cake and eat it too with keeping RNG in the game and letting players succeed where they think they should succeed. Introduce skill check thresholds. Let's say you get to Scratch, and he's describing entities that sound like gnolls. The threshold is you need to have a history of at least 2. If you have 2 or higher, you automatically know he's talking about gnolls. If you don't meet the threshold, you have to roll for it. It's basically like the DM going, yeah, your character just knows what this thing is. Or, yeah, that boulder would be nothing to your character, nothing to the character you built. I'm not gonna bother making you roll for it. You just do it. That way players get to feel the character they built is competent if they specialize, but you aren't punished for being a jack of all trades, like you were in previous CRPGs of old, looking at you, KOTOR 1, and needing a repair skill of 27 to get all of HK47 dialogue. No, I'm not bitter!
Yes, Master. Of course, Master.
It might sound strange, but story has been one area where the data has been a boon. At one point during our talk, Vincke pulls up an image to show me what's essentially a graph of the paths players have taken through specific story dialogue, and what outcomes they receive. Vincke estimated it covered about 30,000 dialogues worth of data, with some results being clear majority and other ones that might require use of certain mechanics or knowledge, having fewer players reach that conclusion. Vincke describes these analytics tools, which the studio built up after the success of Divinity Original Sin 2, as a gold mine. It helps the studio identify what players are doing and make inferences and potentially adapt if they're seeing a choice being taken too often or not often enough, or even if the choice is one they want to feel special and earned, keep it that way. I call it a very modern way of doing game development, because you finally have the data processing to be able to do these kinds of things, Vincke says. And it improves it, literally. I mean, there's nothing to be done about it. It makes the games better. They just need time, they need to cook. I hope this leads to more dialogue options across the board. Something I complained about in my BG3 Let's Play critique, at least 3 times a video, is the lack of dialogue options and how hard it is to roleplay my character with so few options. I certainly hope this statement doesn't mean they are considering removing any, because there are few of them as it is. Dragon Age Origins is absolutely beating out Baldur's Gate 3 in this regard. I cut DOS 2 some slack on this front, because the game doesn't say how you word things except in the group dialogue conversations, which are all terrible, and filled with binary choices that lack nuance. In regards to the tech itself, it's super impressive, and I thought as much the first time they talked about it in the panel from Hell 1, and I still think so. Story is certainly of importance because Baldur's Gate 3 leans much heavier into a cinematic approach. Conversations occur in framed, animated shots rather than talking heads, and every companion has their own lines of dialogue to pore over, both on the road and back at camp. Currently in early access, there's only the first hub act of the game, and while there have been updates adding new content, including a new class for players to pick in character creation, there's still a fragile balance between showing enough to get good feedback and not revealing all of what Larian is working on. Vincke says the studio is trying to be very conservative with what they launch in the early access period, That doesn't mean there won't be anything more, but there's also the concern of releasing too much and watching players burn out. He says there are already people who played 300 to 400 hours of Baldur's Gate 3 in early access. I have a friend, if you're watching this video, that said she's afraid of burning out on early access because of her previous experiences with other EA titles. It's a very real and understandable fear. I am not one of those people. I will play this game as much as necessary to help Larian, because I look at this game and I see that it has the potential to surpass Divinity Original Sin 2 as my favorite game of all time. But it's nowhere near that. In fact, it hasn't even surpassed Dragon Age Origins for me yet. You could argue that it would be a lot easier to just throw everything into early access and then just work with all that feedback and then release it at the end of the experience, Vincke says. And at the same time, you could say, well, if I do that, and I haven't dealt with everything, and players happen to have a bad experience there, then that's their entire impression of the game, that it was a bad experience. I wish there was an easier solution to this. Maybe an opt-in beta that lets players try out and give feedback of future content, but it features several warnings and a quiz at the end to ensure that they actually read it. Because judging by reading the Steam forums, about only 1 in 5 people actually read the store page and early access description or the FAQ. Larian is still working on the game too, Vincke says. The studio doesn't have the content of the end of the game ready yet, and if it did, Vincke doesn't think they'll put it in early access. They didn't for DOS 1 or DOS 2. The studio has a large army of testers, and the early access is not in its testing ground for QA. The early access is there for community feedback on systems that are present there and will be throughout the rest of the game. I already knew this. Swen has said many times EA players aren't testers. They aren't testers, they aren't QA, they are not a substitute for QA. What people don't seem to realize is the game that we are playing in early access has most of the things that the QA testers have found removed. All the bad things that the QA testers have found, that's out. All the stuff that would be game ruining. That reasoning helps give context to why the Druid was the next class in line to hit the early access. Druid plays a pretty major role in the first hub, but when I asked Vincke why it was the latest class to an early access build, the answer surprised me a bit. It's one of the hardest classes to get right, Vincke tells me. So we wanted to put it in there to force ourselves to go through the entire process of that class, and at the same time see what people were going to be doing with it, because we're going to be going fairly far with what you can do with Wild Shape. Vincke says that Larian has ambitions still for what it's going to add. Druid provides a very different experience compared to other classes, so it's an interesting question mark to address now rather than later. So we're not going to necessarily put the classes that are easiest to make first into early access. We're putting the ones that are interesting for us also to see what the community does with it, Vincke says. Rip Paladins, because they're a bit too similar to clerics. They're probably going to be later down the road. Swen has made it no secret he doesn't like bards.
Poisonous tentacles or even wings with which you can dash over the battlefield, so it's going to be a very, very cool skill tree. But you will also be able to vote for other, perhaps not so cool stuff, but still very cool stuff like Trapmaster or Bard. Or
Who wants to have that one guy that's always singing and helping people to...
You really think that people are going to be singing in combat?
Is this not why music was invented?
Oh my god, I'm being attacked by this huge dragon! Dum, 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 dum. Come on guys, up the morale!
About Brave Sir Robin?
Nobody will vote Bard.
I'll vote Robin. We'll see.
Alright, well.
So my money is on Sorcerer being the next class implemented, and I hope it is, because Druid just isn't for me, as I came to realize pretty early on in my Druid playthrough. I am very much a Wizard, Warlock, Sorc kind of player, so it was hard for me to give feedback to Larian they probably weren't already aware of. Should have left critiquing the Druid class itself to people that like to play Druid. That said, insight can be gained from an outsider's perspective, so if Larian does watch that series, which I am canceling, update video on why in a day or so, I hope they got useful data out of it. Throughout early access, these decisions have been made. What to show now, and what to wait on. Vincke tells me that the process of determining just where the early access cuts off was simply trying to find places that made logical sense. But even that is tricky. Not every path has a natural climax, so Larian had to find cuts that felt reasonable, even if there also artificial. You can really feel this in regards to the Githyanki Crash quest line. You get to the old school Bioware-style world map, and the game is like, sorry, not in early access yet. I am happy that there's going to be a world map like Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 and Dragon Age Origin. When I first saw that screen, my eyes lit up, and it was the hypest I had been for something in a long while. I certainly hope that was a promise of things to come, and not just something to placate old fans. One way this can already be seen is in Baldur's Gate 3's companions. Of the traveling adventures you can recruit to your cause right now, there are a number of fascinating characters: the enigmatic Shadowheart, the intriguing Astarion, and the fairly direct Lysel, to name a few. The player fights alongside them during the day, but upon returning to camp, they can interact with these characters and have conversations that shed more light on their backstories. Already, there are theories about what certain dialogues mean or could imply for future story arcs in the full release, and Vincke says we're only seeing fragments of their storylines right now. It's interesting to see what people write about them, and making their opinion, especially if you know stuff that comes later, so it's cool to see. But it also tells you, yeah, okay, well, they're completely seeing this person like that, and that's actually not what we meant from the get-go. We wanted them to seem like that. Yeah, a lot of people take the character of Gale at face value and ignore a lot of the nuance of his character. He can come off as a smugger, more up his own ass version of Alistair from Dragon Age if you don't actually get to know him. It could also be that the triggers for getting his scenes are nonsensical and need work, and that's why people have the wrong impression of him. But I'll be saving my thoughts on Gale and the other origin characters for my companions tier list video, so look forward to that. My only hope is that they don't repeat what they did in DOS 2's epilogue. Every origin character had a default ending if you weren't playing them, and if ends where I'm gonna try and dance around spoilers if I can, where he fucks off and is never seen again, and I was like, what? Bitch, you said you loved me. Why did you leave? I had to headcanon that my character went with him just to not be furious at the ending. Also, don't do what Baldur's Gate 2's Enhanced Edition does, where no matter what you do, there is no happy ending to the Dorn romance at all. Not every ending has to be a happy one, but there should at least be a few positive ones, and a golden ending or a couple golden endings where everything turns out alright. If all my choices are bad and lead to bad things, then it's the same as having no choice at all in my eyes. I believe the opposite to also be true. Baldur's Gate 3 is also pretty open-ended. The first area literally drops you into the first hub after its big opening sequence, who you talk to, and what leads to chase in terms of getting that pesky illithid tadpole out of your brain. Vincke says it's vastly more complex than Divinity Original Sin 2 was in terms of permutations, but there's also parts we haven't seen yet. Significant changes to the main storyline that weren't ready or included yet. Even in the first act area, Vincke says the team is very iterative in its process, so things change. I imagine several of those things have to do with the custom character, because they said that custom characters would be just as important to the narrative as the origin characters, and would have as strong ties to the world and the plot as them in the AMA. This is not the case in the current version of the game. I have a video planned to elaborate on this further as well. The scripting is done, but I haven't got all the footage I need yet, so stay tuned for that. Of course, there is combat, Vincke says. The team is working on that aspect as well. He says they think it's a little bit too random still, in cases where they'd like it to be more tactical. They're also tooling with the RNG in some areas, and are looking for ways of streamlining it to have a more modern experience. I do agree that I have found the RNG to be really frustrating and unfun in patch 4. This could be, again, me playing as a class that's just not for me in the Druid, but we'll see. Martial classes are a particular area in highlights, as having a party full of just fighters can be tricky, which I found pretty interesting. In my own experience, I've been loving the ability to push, shove, throw things to manipulate the world with my Githyanki warrior, and those mechanics are something he says he's happy people are grappling with. He tells me in a recent meeting, some of the studio members were discussing ways in which they had defeated an encounter using their own ingenuity and exploiting systems in unexpected ways, something Vincke says is one of the core pillars of what Larian is trying to do. I have not been able to make use of the shove mechanic. A lot of people think it's really strong, be all and end all. But literally no one in my party can make use of it in combat because strength is our dump stat. Literally the only character that can shove in my druid playthrough is Lizelle, and I don't take her along very often. So the people complaining about shove, I do think it could be toned down a little bit. The distance you shove people could be toned down and based on strength rather than just being a flat. If you succeed in pushing someone, they are going this far based on how high up you are, rather than the distance should be determined by strength. I'm happy that strength is less of a dump stat, because strength compared to dexterity is often really weak in CRPGs. Also, this is not me saying that shove is a weak mechanic. I'm saying shove can't be as strong as people are making it out to be, because not every single character can just use shove. No one in my party can use shove. In fact, no one in my party can do barrelmancy. We can't even lift barrels. I mean, that's why we put those mechanics in there, Vincke says. So the creative use of the mechanics for the players is the thing that we try to maximize. D&D is about your agency, your creativity. We're trying to give you the same tool set still in a fairly accessible way. This is part of why I love Swen and Larian in general. Their unwillingness to compromise on their systemic design principles are what make DOS 2 my favorite game of all time. While development is proceeding, Larian Studios has not been immune to the effects of the global pandemic. The team made a swift move to working from home, and while adapted rapidly, thanks in part to experience working with teams across the globe, the missing component was direct communication. The leads being able to directly communicate with their teams has been one of the harder points of the pandemic, Vincke tells me. Having to do sound mixing online versus in person is one area he highlights, as well as doing motion capture for cinematics. It has become more prominent in Baldur's Gate 3 than in previous Larian games. He does envision the studio returning to the office once it's safe, joking about meeting the new hires they've made in the last year or so, face-to-face rather than over video. Swen has talked about it before in previous interviews, but it still sucks to hear about how much of a hard time COVID gave them. The name Baldur's Gate has been looming overhead. Vincke recognized the pressure that came with the name early on, and that incorporating more cinematics into their games was a big gamble. The reception has been good though, and Vincke says the studio hasn't compromised on the amount of choices it offers to players in the game. They haven't compromised on choice, but they did compromise on something else, and that something else is letting us roleplay. The character animations often don't match the character we are roleplaying, or the idea of the character we have in our head. Hopefully this is something they can work on throughout the development, because stuff like this really takes me out of it, as well as many others. I'm sure Larian has gotten plenty of feedback on this before. There needs to be some sort of system where you can, during character creation, you can say, your character reacts to these certain situations in this way, and through that there can be alternate character animations in cutscenes, so that my character doesn't look weird and terrified during the Mind Flare scene where he wouldn't be, or he wouldn't fall over like a dope during the dragon scene during Avernus. When I asked whether Vincke and Larian Studios know when version 1.0 is coming, I compared it to a train pulling into the station. Vincke says they know where, but don't know when. They know where the ending is, and they have a pretty good overview of what's left to do, and that they need to do them right. So we still have quite some work ahead of us, Vincke says, but we do know what we're making and where we're going to be. We'll know when we're at the end, so it is visible. It's just still a lot of work. It'll be ready when it's ready. I'm very happy that they are sticking to this statement, and not rushing it like CD Projekt Red did. It does help that Larian isn't beholden to investors or shareholders like they were. As we wrapped up our conversation, I remarked that I was eager to jump back in afterwards and maybe make a new character to try some of the druid abilities out for myself. Vincke's response surprised me, and ended up being my biggest takeaway to not burn myself out on Baldur's Gate 3. Advised to try to keep some surprises for yourself, because things are still changing. Baldur's Gate 3 is still changing. There are still aspects of this game that might be different in some ways I could overlook. thinking I had seen them already in early access. The worst that could happen is that when Baldur's Gate 3 finally launches, I'll skip through a scene or not try out a choice because I think I've already seen and know it. That's not what Larian is planning on. You won't know it, Vincke says. It will be different, and that's the promise. I'm not surprised by this response at all. This has been Swen's mantra even before the EA came out during the first panel from Hell, and was later echoed in the Drop Frames interview. Early access is not meant for you to play over and over and over to the point where you're sick of the game. I'm doing that because I know my limits and my tolerance for such things, which is another reason why my Baldur's Gate 3 critique Let's Play is coming to an end. Again, more on that in the update video. Thank you, Eric Van Allen. Your interview was fantastic, and thank you, Swen, for being a fantastic interviewee, as always. If you enjoyed the content of this video, please like the video, comment down below, share the video around, and subscribe to the channel, because it tells me you like my content and want me to keep making it. It also helps the channel grow. Until next time, later.